Brussels had taught Marx to turn philosophy toward history. The manifesto would ask him to turn that history into a voice direct enough for a movement. Chapter 6. The Manifesto and the Year Europe Trembled. Friedrich Engels had already tried to give the Communist League a clear statement before Karl Marx turned the work into the text that would become famous. His draft, prepared in the form of questions and answers, carried the title Principles of Communism, and it belonged to an older catechism style common in political and religious instruction. A question was asked, an answer followed, and the reader moved step by step through doctrine. The form had practical value for an organization that needed members to understand its aims. Yet Marx and Engels both saw that the moment required something broader than a catechism. The League did not only need answers, it needed a historical argument with a public voice. The Communist League had grown out of circles of German workers and émigrés, especially those living beyond Germany's borders. Its earlier motto had spoken of all men as brothers, a phrase carrying the older warmth of democratic and religious universalism. Under the influence of Marx and Engels, the League moved toward a more definite language of class. Workers of all countries were called to unite, not because sentiment alone joined them, but because modern production had placed them in related conditions across borders. This change was small in wording and large in meaning. It marked the passage from moral fellowship to historical position. Marx received the task of drafting the final statement under pressure. The League wanted the work completed, and reminders followed him because he was not always quick to deliver what organizations requested from him. He could write with great force, but he also delayed, revised, read further, quarreled with formulations, and allowed projects to grow larger than their immediate purpose. Manifesto writing was therefore an act of compression. Years of argument with German philosophy, French socialism, British political economy, and exile politics had to be reduced into a short work that could move through the hands of workers, radicals, and party members without carrying the full burden of the notebooks behind it. The pamphlet that appeared in February 1848 was not a large book. It did not present the full economic analysis Marx would spend later decades trying to complete. Its strength lay elsewhere, in the way it gathered history into a moving shape. It described past societies through conflict between classes, then presented the bourgeoisie as the revolutionary class that had broken feudal relations, expanded markets, altered production, and drawn the world into a system of exchange. The tone was severe, but it was not merely denunciatory. Marx and Engels understood capitalism as historically powerful before they judged it historically limited. This was one of the more unsettling features of their argument. They did not portray the bourgeoisie as weak, foolish, or merely parasitic. They described it as a class that had transformed the world with extraordinary energy, dissolving older bonds, remaking cities, pushing technology forward, and making production more extensive than any earlier society had known. The critique began with recognition. Capitalism had accomplished something immense, and because it had done so, it had also created new dependencies, new crises, and a new working class gathered by the very system that exploited it. The manifesto's account of history moved quickly, almost too quickly for the complexity it claimed to cover. Ancient society, feudal society, guild production, manufacturing, modern industry, colonial expansion, and world markets all appeared in compressed form. Yet the speed was part of the design. This was not a patient scholarly treatise. It was a political statement meant to locate the present inside a long historical movement. A worker reading it was not being asked simply to resent an employer. He was being placed inside a story about the making of the modern world. The proletariat, in Marx and Engels' account, was not only poor. Poverty alone did not make a revolutionary class. What mattered was the workers' relation to production, separated from ownership, dependent on wages, gathered into workplaces, exposed to market shifts, and made part of a collective condition even when life felt individually precarious. This was why the manifesto treated the working class as the possible agent of a future transformation. Its power did not come from moral innocence. It came from the structural place capitalism itself had given it. Such claims were still only partly matched by the political reality of the time. In 1848, industrial development was uneven across Europe, and many workers were artisans rather than factory laborers in the English sense. Peasants still formed huge parts of the population, and national questions often stirred people more directly than class analysis. Marx and Engels knew some of this, but the manifesto spoke in a language that made the most advanced tendencies of modern society stand for its future direction. That is one reason the text outlived its immediate setting. It described not only what Europe was, but what Marx and Engels believed Europe was becoming. A slogan can travel farther than a system. Workers of all countries, unite, had the clarity of a phrase that could leave the page and enter meetings, banners, translations, and memory. The rest of Marx's work would rarely be so brief. Capital would move through commodities, value, labor time, machinery, circulation, accumulation, and crisis with a density that demanded patient reading. The manifesto moved differently. It joined historical breadth to organizational urgency, and that made it the one Marxist text many people would know even if they never entered the heavier rooms of Marx's thought. Its publication came at a strange moment, almost too sharply timed. In February 1848, revolution began in Paris. King Louis-Philippe fell, a republic was proclaimed, and the news moved across Europe with a force that governments could not easily contain. Vienna, Berlin, Milan, Budapest, Prague, and other cities soon entered the season of upheaval in their own ways. The causes differed by place: constitutional demands, national movements, food distress, liberal frustration, worker unrest, anger at censorship, and resentment of old regimes. The year did not belong to one revolution, but to many revolutions overlapping. Marx was in Brussels when this wider crisis opened. Belgian authorities, already uneasy about foreign radicals, became less willing to tolerate him. He was arrested briefly and then expelled, a reminder that revolutionary years often begin not with barricades in every street, but with police decisions, passports, and orders to leave. Jenny, pregnant and burdened again by the instability of his life, had to endure another forced movement. The grand language of European upheaval entered the Marx household as packing, official pressure, and the necessity of finding the next city. Paris briefly received Marx again after the February Revolution, but the center of his effort soon turned back toward the Rhineland. Germany now seemed open in a way it had not been during the years of censorship and exile. If old controls were weakening, then journalism could become an instrument of revolutionary intervention once more. Marx did not imagine himself primarily as a street fighter. His weapon was print, and the revolutions of 1848 appeared to offer the possibility that newspapers, clubs, assemblies, and democratic agitation might reshape political life. Engels, too, was drawn into the revolutionary current. The collaboration that had produced the manifesto now moved from theory and organization into events whose direction no one could fully command. This was one of the hard lessons of 1848. A text could name the forces of history, but revolutions did not unfold as obedient illustrations of theory. Liberals feared workers, distrusted bourgeois reformers. Peasants had their own needs. National movements collided with one another, and monarchies retreated just enough to survive before recovering strength. The year carried hope, but it also carried confusion in every direction. The manifesto's early reception was modest compared with its later fame. It did not cause the revolutions of 1848, and it was not immediately the central text of European radicalism. Its first readership was limited, and the very movements it hoped to guide were already overtaking the small organizations that had commissioned it. This is worth remembering, because famous works often acquire, in retrospect, a false brightness at the moment of birth. The manifesto entered the world as a pamphlet for a small communist organization during a crisis far larger than that organization could control. Still, the text mattered because it gave Marx and Engels a voice that could survive defeat. If 1848 failed, the manifesto would remain as the distilled record of what they believed the age had revealed: that modern society was organized by class relations, that capitalism was dynamic and unstable, that workers had become a historical force, and that political struggle could not be understood apart from production and property. Its claims would be revised, debated, simplified, weaponized, and misread many times after Marx's death. In its first year, however, it belonged to a living crisis, not to a library shelf. Marx's path now bent toward Cologne again. The city where censorship had first educated him became the city where he would try to write inside revolution itself. The Rheinische Zeitung was gone, but a new paper could be made, and the failure or success of German upheaval seemed still undecided. The young editor who had once argued over wood theft and press freedom returned with a larger theory, a famous collaborator, and a Europe in motion around him. The manifesto had compressed his thought into a call. Cologne would test what that call could mean when revolution had to pass through offices, courts, assemblies, soldiers, printers, debts, and the slow return of state power. Chapter 7: Cologne again, Revolution, and the long road to exile. Cologne had already taught Karl Marx what a newspaper could do before the state closed its hand around it. In 1848, he returned to the city with more than memory. The revolutions that had begun in Paris had unsettled the German states, weakened old certainties, and opened spaces where speech, assembly, and print seemed briefly capable of becoming forces in public life. Marx came back not as the young editor of the Rheinische Zeitung, still discovering the material weight of law and property, but as one of the authors of the Communist Manifesto, carrying a sharper account of class, history, and political struggle. The city was familiar, but the moment was different enough to make old methods seem newly possible. The paper he helped build was the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. Its title deliberately recalled the suppressed paper of 1842 and 1843, but this was not simply a revival. It called itself an organ of democracy, and it tried to speak into the revolutionary crisis with a firmness that unsettled both conservative authorities and more cautious liberals. Marx became its editor-in-chief, and the newspaper office again became his main arena. Articles had to be written, funds had to be found, printers had to be managed, and political events moved faster than any system could comfortably explain them. Revolution, when lived through day by day, rarely resembles the clean lines later drawn around it. Germany in 1848 was not one country moving with one will. It was a patchwork of monarchies, free cities, principalities, parliaments, military commands, local grievances, and national hopes. Liberals wanted constitutions, civil rights, and national unity, but many feared the social demands of workers and the poor. Democrats wanted wider suffrage and deeper political change. Workers wanted wages, bread, organization, and dignity. Peasants wanted relief from burdens that still carried the residue of feudal relations. The same year could hold all these desires at once, and the difficulty lay in the fact that they did not always support one another. Marx's paper pressed for a radical democratic line. It argued against the weakness of liberal compromise and criticized the tendency of the bourgeoisie to retreat once popular pressure threatened property and order. This was not yet a Workers' Party newspaper in the later sense. The immediate task, as Marx saw it, was to push the democratic revolution as far as it could go against monarchy, feudal remnants, censorship, and reaction. He believed that only through such struggle could the deeper conflict of modern society become clearer. The strategy required patience inside urgency, a difficult combination for any revolutionary year. The daily work of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung was shaped by more than doctrine. Reports arrived from Berlin, Vienna, Paris, Hungary, Italy, and the Rhineland countryside. Assemblies debated constitutions while soldiers waited. Ministers changed, committees formed, associations met, and rumors ran ahead of confirmed news. A newspaper had to turn this confusion into interpretation by morning. The press room, with its deadlines, ink, type, and unpaid bills, became one of the places where revolution passed into material form. Without such offices, much of 1848 would have remained local noise. With them, events became arguments that could travel. Marx's position placed him at odds with many forces at once. Conservatives saw the paper as dangerous. Moderate liberals found it too severe. Some radicals found it insufficiently immediate or too committed to political analysis over direct action. The authorities watched it closely, and prosecutions followed. The state did not need to defeat the revolution in one movement in order to pressure its newspapers. It could bring charges, demand bonds, threaten printers, and use the courts as instruments of discipline. Once again, Marx was learning that public speech survived only while it could withstand administrative and financial strain. The most memorable legal confrontation came in 1849, when Marx and others connected to the paper stood trial in Cologne. The charges arose from their political agitation, including appeals connected to tax resistance and opposition to the government. The outcome matters because it showed for a moment the uncertain balance of the revolutionary period. Marx defended the conduct of the paper and the democratic movement before a jury, presenting the issue as a conflict between the people's rights and a government that had betrayed the revolution's promises. He was acquitted. The courtroom gave him a public victory, but not a secure one. An acquittal could clear a man without saving his newspaper. That was one of the hard facts of the year's decline. Legal procedure, public sympathy, and verbal brilliance might win a case, while the broader political structure continued to close. The Prussian state was recovering its nerve. The monarchy had yielded under pressure in 1848, but it had not dissolved. The army remained. Bureaucratic authority remained. Conservative forces waited, reorganized, and used the divisions among revolutionaries to regain control. The revolution had opened doors, but many of those doors led into rooms still guarded by the old order. The Frankfurt Parliament, which had tried to create a unified constitutional Germany, became one of the symbols of liberal limitation. Its debates were serious, and many of its members were honorable men, but it lacked the power to compel the princes and armies whose authority it hoped to reorganize. When the crown of a united Germany was offered to the Prussian king, Friedrich Wilhelm IV refused it on terms that would have made him a monarch by parliamentary gift. The failure exposed the weakness of a revolution that could deliberate more easily than it could command. Marx saw in such moments the inability of liberal constitutionalism to carry a revolution through when property and monarchy still held practical force. The Neue Rheinische Zeitung responded to these failures with increasing sharpness. Its pages defended revolutionary movements beyond the Rhineland and took interest in struggles across Europe, including Hungary and Poland, because Marx and Engels viewed the democratic question as continental rather than local. Their judgments on national movements were shaped by the politics of their time and were not always generous or simple. Yet the broader point remained consistent. Reaction could not be fought city by city if the old order supported itself across borders. A revolution in one place had to understand the movements and pressures around it. Engels became more directly involved in revolutionary activity than Marx himself during parts of this period, especially in the armed conflicts that followed the collapse of hopes in 1849. Marx's own battlefield remained print, organization, and analysis. This distinction mattered. Later images of revolution often prefer the visible figure in the street, but movements also depend on those who write addresses, argue strategy, raise funds, edit reports, and interpret defeat. Marx was not physically timid in any simple sense, but his deepest habit was intellectual and editorial. He moved through revolution as a